Hello, my name is David Santana, and I'm going to be making a video about Dr. Emily Bernard's book, Black is the Body, and the sixth chapter in it called Skin. Um, the sixth chapter is a really good one, and it kind of tackles the question of how race is introduced into her daughter's childhood and kind of how she's going about dealing with it in regards to how it's going to affect her children, but also dealing with it and how it's affected her. Emily starts the chapter with a little bit of in media res. She kind of drops us off in the middle of a story where she has some guests over, and the daughter of the guest is admiring slash examining Emily's hands. The differences in their color and the differences in the lines on their palms. Um, Thomas, who is the guest, has her daughter stop and sit still. He is trying to be sensitive about the fact that his child noticed the difference in skin color. Um, this is kind of concerning because it it kind of instills at a very young age kind of like a negative connection with acknowledging this very basic part of reality. Emily later notes that she took pleasure in seeing how uh, the the daughter was pleased by examining this and noticing the difference. But that didn't matter because the father, who was a very sensitive person apparently, did not want that to happen. So Emily moves on from that scenario and says that one day her daughter asked her what color their father is. And this happens while they're just getting in the car for school. And it reminds me of how kids, like, we think that these are some really highbrow concepts, but to kids, these are just questions that they'd like answers to. And I thought that was interesting how they're just getting ready for school one day, and then their daughter brings up this question of what race is dad or what color is he? So their daughter's asking this question is kind of the uh, a new step in their understanding of race as a concept and color as a concept. And it's going to be like kind of the first step in their kind of introduction to the world and race relations in a way. And so Emily is kind of walking on eggshells when she's explaining this to her daughter. And Emily says that she wants to make a differentiation between race and color. She says in the book that race was trauma and color was beauty. And she says that because race is a learned experience. It is not something that you're born with. It is something that you kind of inherit. But that color is just a natural state of being and existing. And so Emily wants her children to have a period of time where they aren't burdened by this learned trauma of race and how it's really difficult for Emily as a mother and as a scholar in African American history and literature and culture that she's wondering, do I ignore this to preserve some sense of innocence for her children? But the truth is that the children will eventually inherit this as they enter into the world. So Emily has to choose whether she should even bother with telling the stories of racism and discrimination that have, in a way, defined her life, her grandmother's life, and her mother's life as well, and so on. Or whether she should try and preserve the innocence that comes along with not knowing. Emily says that those stories about racial discrimination and racial, just racism, sort of define her identity. But she wonders if they define her identity in a good way or in a bad way. Her daughters sort of have a chance to be a clean slate because their father is white, and they're growing up in a white home. They have this opportunity to kind of let it slide off their back and start fresh. But the problem is that they need to learn about this because their lives are not just going to encompass their family. Simply because their father is white and in a way serves as a beacon for the good conscience of white people, the world is much broader. So the children are not always going to live in that bubble. So that bubble is popped pretty early, as Julia, her daughter, says that she experiences a racist scene play out right in front of her. And the racist scene is one that Julia is the main point of contention. A white boy announces on the bus that he would never marry a girl with skin like Julia's. The other kids stood up and said that it was a racist thing to say, which is good, Emily notes, because she didn't have that when she was growing up. Julia seems to not be bothered, she says, and takes it as an empowering experience that she kind of let this kid slide. But had she not been reinforced by her surroundings that this was a bad thing for this other boy to do, it might not have been so empowering for her to let it slide. It might have been a point of shame. So Emily talks about how Julia says she wants to marry someone with a different skin tone, and that she is speaking from a place of love that she has for her father, who is white. This is interesting because Emily starts to go down a rabbit trail about why it's actually concerning that Julia wants to marry someone who has a different skin tone from her. And she hears the voice of her father saying that white boys are only after one thing. She talks about how being a black girl makes a person extra vulnerable. And essentially what she has with her husband is unique in a way. Her husband is also an academic that studies African American history and culture. And he is not the kind of average white person. And so if their children get trusting and fond of their father and kind of impart that goodwill on all white people, then they're actually going to be more vulnerable for it, because there's a lot of people who just are not privy to some of these things, and that essentially her daughters have a really hard task ahead of them, because they love their white father. They see no issue with white people at this age, and that is actually kind of dangerous. Black children have to be raised differently, Emily talks about. She says that especially in public, they have to behave differently from regular white kids, and that they're forced to grow up earlier, and they have to understand more abstract concepts if they want to be safe. Emily says that this is obvious to her when she's talking with someone in a predominantly black area, and she says that white people teach their children how to live, but we have to teach our children how to survive. And so that just kind of speaks to how black people, they kind of have to grow up earlier if they want to survive. Because it is imperative that they understand these concepts in order to live. She kind of backs this up later by talking about how there was a situation that a black man was trying to go into his house in the Northeast where she was living at the time, and how the police were called on him, and that it's just a shame that he can't even enter his own house without being suspected of a crime. And she quotes someone who says, "Dark skin stands out in a white place." And it's just funny because that person is right. Yeah, dark skin stands out in a white place because people have different colored skin. But why does it stand out for that reason instead of any other reason whatsoever? And that's the difficult thing that the children are having to understand. She then goes on to talk about how the concept of colorblindness is sort of the easy way to deal with this idea and this difficult situation. If you can just raise your children without the concept of race or color, you never have to address this thing. She sort of says that this is a disservice to both white people and black people, and that it's bad to see it as an innocent solution because it distances people from what they're trying to learn about. So Emily talks about how when children are reading Huckleberry Finn, they brush over the use of the N-word, and they don't even address the meaning that it's meant to be carrying in the book, and how that is problematic because it raises a question when there is the use of the N-word in a book, but it doesn't answer the question. And so it leaves you in a worse place than when you started. She also says that this is similar to how Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is taught. It's used so casually and so, I don't know, like, it's used poorly when taught, and so it kind of turns into a tagline and a cliche instead of what it was, which I have written down that it was a desperate cry for change. So Emily then talks about how her adult students do not even feel comfortable acknowledging the skin color of black people when it comes up in daily conversations, and how that dehumanizes the people that they interact with, because you're essentially looking past a fundamental part of who they are, and you're severing off a section of your brain that is wired to deal with that part of who they are. So Emily then kind of loops back to say how her children are, like we had said earlier, growing up in a predominantly white world. And as Emily is like traveling and gone, she sort of has this ability to take away all of the history that she imparts and all of the conversations. She imparts stories about trauma about dark truths, about pain. She teaches these lessons to her kids just when they're going to school and hanging out. So she feels this guilt about being kind of a huge downer. And she sometimes wonders if it would be best if she was not that type of a person when raising her children. But she essentially says that her children would be hurt in the long run without those lessons and without those conversations. Because who's to say that they won't turn out to be like those adults that Emily teaches, who do not even feel comfortable referring to somebody openly about their skin color and not judging them for it. So she is ultimately justifying her relationship as a teacher of this stuff to her children. And she ends the chapter on the topic of hands. She's holding the hand of her daughter, and they're walking together. And she refuses to let her daughter become another victim of the type of life that she lived and the type of world that she was raised in. And how she, holding her daughter's hand, will try and make something better. This chapter was really powerful. I think it's kind of what I wanted Emily to talk about, but there was so much context that needed to be introduced before we could talk about it, and it was really beautifully written. I wish I could read it like to my friends and to my parents and stuff, but yeah, it was just a great chapter. That's all I'm gonna cover because I'm already running over the time limit. So thank you.